This video was brought to you by Incogni. Last week, the IMF released its latest set of economic forecasts for 2024.
According to the fund, the fastest growing large economy in Europe this year is set to be Spain,
which is due to see its GDP expand by 1.9%, well above both the EU average and other big European countries. This comes after Spain posted some pretty impressive numbers in 2023, growing by roughly 2.5%, having weathered the energy crisis better than most of its European counterparts. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why Spain's economy has fared so well recently, why this has been unsurprisingly great news for Pedro Sanchez and the incumbent socialist government, and try our best to figure out whether this relative boom can last. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's just start by taking a look at the data. As we mentioned in the intro, the IMF expects Spain to experience GDP growth of 1.9% in 2024. Now, this might not sound great, but it's well above the Eurozone's average of 0.8%, and even further above that of other large European economies. France and Italy, for instance, have forecast to grow by just 0.7% in 2024, while Germany is looking at relatively measly growth of just 0.2%.
In fact, the only large developed country expected to do better than Spain this year is the US,
which is currently enjoying levels of growth well above anything that Europe could hope to achieve at the moment. And this all broadly accords with the latest Eurostat data, which anticipates Spain's economy growing by 1.7% in 2024 and 2% in 2025, surpassing the EU average of 0.9% and 1.7% respectively. Eurostat also expects Spain to see average inflation of 3.2% for the year, slightly above the EU average of 3%, but is due to decline to 2.1% by 2025, below the forecast EU average of 2.5%. And at the same time, Spain's main stock index, the IBEX 35, surged by more than 10% last month, marking 4 consecutive weeks of gains and reaching a 7-year high. Now, if you're partial to stereotypes about lazy southern Europeans, you might expect this growth to be driven by excessive government borrowing. And this is sort of the case in Italy at the moment, where a significant fraction of its nominally impressive GDP growth is being driven by the so-called super bonus, a generous tax relief on home improvements introduced in 2020, which has cost the government billions of euros and is perhaps the main reason that Italy ran an astonishingly large budget deficit of 7.2% of GDP last year. However, Spain's government finances look remarkably solid at the moment. While Spain's debt to GDP ratio is still pretty high, it's fallen from 120% at the peak of the pandemic to near 107% today, and Spain is due to run a relatively modest budget deficit of just 2.9% of GDP this year. Now, this might not sound that great. After all, it is still a deficit, but it's within the Maastricht criteria, which itself is pretty good by European standards at the moment. France, for instance, is due to run a budget deficit nearly twice as large as Spain's, and other European countries like Finland have only been able to stay within the 3% target by resorting to drastic austerity measures. This is why last month, Moody's revised Spain's credit rating to positive, helping Spain's borrowing costs fall to a post-pandemic low. The spread between Spanish and German 10-year bonds is now less than 1%, the smallest it's been since 2022, and well below the 10-year average. And this is all yet another promising data point for Southern Europe's economy, which has been performing surprisingly well recently, and more good news for incumbent Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez and his Socialist Party, who enjoyed their best results since 2012 at last weekend's Basque Country elections. And Sanchez has emerged as a real survivor in European politics. At the same time as the right's been on the rise across the rest of Europe, his Socialist Party has been able to hang on to power for the past few years. And Spain's relatively strong economic performance is one of the big reasons behind his enduring electability. So, why is Spain's economy actually doing so well? Well, there has been a post-pandemic boom in tourism, which has definitely helped. But Spain was also less affected by last year's energy crisis, in part because the Spanish government implemented some surprisingly successful price controls, but also because Spain never imported that much Russian gas in the first place. But one of the things that's particularly interesting is that the IMF cites a boost in domestic demand and strong wage growth as one of the main reasons behind Spain's relative overperformance. For context, thanks to a tight labour market and a new agreement between the big unions and employers in May, Spanish wages grew by 5.2% in 2023, and they'll be further helped by a 5% minimum wage increase that came into force in January. Strong wage growth has also helped to reduce inequality, and Spain's Gini coefficient, a popular measure of income inequality, is now at the lowest level in 16 years. Anyway, this represents an interesting ideological U-turn from the IMF, which has historically advocated for restrained wage growth, i.e. lower wages, on the grounds that it means less inflation and improved competitiveness. However, in the past few years or so, an increasing number of Western economists, including apparently parts of the IMF, have started calling for stronger wages to stimulate domestic demand within the EU. For example, last week, former ECB Governor Mario Draghi, who's currently writing a report on the EU's competitiveness, gave a speech where he said that Europe made a mistake after the Eurozone crisis by pursuing a strategy of lower wage costs and austerity, because it ended up weakening domestic demand and undermining the European social model. What Draghi is basically saying here is that while suppressing wages might help European exports more competitive to the rest of the world, it also undercuts European purchasing power, which means less demand in Europe itself for European goods, and therefore no reliable growth engine for European industry. And this is exactly what's helped the Spanish economy, at least according to the IMF. Even if strong wage growth made Spanish exports slightly less competitive, it's also created a whole lot more demand within Spain, which has fueled consumption and therefore GDP growth. Now, that's not to say that everything is totally rosy. The Spanish economy still faces a host of long-term problems, including an old and aging population and an enormous debt burden. It's also worth saying that while Spain weathered the Russia-related energy crisis remarkably well, it will be just as exposed as any other European country to a further rise in oil prices, which are already pretty high. Nonetheless, as things stand, Spain is doing pretty well, and Sanchez is right to enjoy his moment in the metaphorical sun. While you've been watching this video, you might not have realized that shady forces in the background are trying to collect your personal data from various sites, bundle it together, and sell it to a third party. These data brokers can then sell your information to anyone, from a company to an online criminal. Now, you might assume that you're always safe online. Perhaps you regularly change your password, or even unsubscribe from those annoying email newsletters that you never even remember signing up for. But unfortunately, this doesn't always save you. Companies that hold your data can still fall victim to a data breach, meaning that these data brokers can still compile all of your information and sell it on to others. The good news is that you have a right to protect your privacy and request that data brokers delete your personal information. But the bad news is that it would take you years to do it manually. And even then, you'd need to repeat this process every few months as data brokers continue collecting your data. Luckily though, this is where our sponsor Incogni comes in. Incogni reaches out to those data brokers on your behalf, requests that your data is removed, and deals with any problems that might arise. Even more, Incogni is persistent and will put in multiple data removal requests even after your data has been removed to ensure that it doesn't go back on the market. So create an account with our link in the description, grant Incogni the ability to work on your behalf, and sit back as they make you safer. Plus, if you use our link, you'll get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Thanks for checking it out, and thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video.